Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with a returning guest, Father Dylan Schrader, to discuss the medieval university style and use of the Latin language. We'll be discussing some of the common linguistic expressions and peculiarities often utilized by scholastic university theologians, and some helpful hints on how better to read and translate their writings. Father Schrader himself has translated scholastic texts such as the Salmanticenses treatise on the motive of the Incarnation, and has written a short guide to scholastic Latin published by the Paideia Institute. Father Schrader, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much. Glad to be back on the podcast.
So I figured before we dive right into maybe the Latin itself, we could give sort of a helpful background to maybe the context in which scholastics are writing and maybe some of their literary prosaic styles. What is the academic context in which scholastics at the medieval university are writing? What literary style do they adopt? Is it typically dialectic? What was their style?
A great question. Scholasticism and the scholastic method is very much connected with the development of the university system, which itself grew out of the cathedral schools that developed in Europe. Kind of a fun way to get a taste of the early developments on the verge of the really golden age of scholasticism, in my opinion, is to read the autobiography of Peter Abelard, which has the provocative title, the history of my misfortunes, Historia Calamitatum. But his autobiography talks about studying with different masters of philosophy and theology, and how the students would come and would devote themselves to learning from an expert in a particular field. And as the cathedral schools developed and really grew, the university system kind of grew organically, because you had people coming from many different places to study together, to live together, study together, and to devote themselves to this kind of academic discussion. Now, the way that they proceeded in that, it's a relatively obvious and simple way to do philosophy and theology, which really is dialectic, kind of a back and forth, looking at different sides of an issue. But it became a hallmark of scholasticism as it developed, because they wanted to show the harmony of truth. So that was one of the primary concerns of the great scholastics, was to show how the different authoritative sources of truth harmonize with one another. So in particular, sacred scripture, philosophy, the natural sciences as they knew them, and whatever other field of knowledge there might be. They recognize that the truth harmonizes with the truth. So one of the challenges that they faced, which led to the adoption of a dialectic method, was seemingly contradictory statements. It could even be within scripture itself, or within, say, the patristic commentators on sacred scripture, that one person might take something in one way, another person might take it in a different way, and there would be seeming contradictions. So in order to get around that, you have to look at both sides of the issue, look at the available data, and then often find a synthesis by making distinctions, distinguishing different perspectives and things like that. So an early work in that tradition is, to go back to Peter Abelard, sic et non, yes and no. And as that becomes formalized, you see the scholastic method really developing. And so, for example, to take the famous structure that we see in the Summa Theologiae, you'll have a question stated, the kind of question that expects a yes or no answer. So that forces you already to a level of precision. And then you'll have arguments for a certain position. You'll have maybe a citation from something authoritative. Then you'll have a resolution of the question with the master's own opinion, and then responses to the other side. So it's a very natural method. It's similar to what you might see even in the dialogues of Plato, for example. But it became formalized in conjunction with the development of the university system.
I know you mentioned authority. What was something that was very widely cited in the medieval universities. So in academic, in these academic writings, do we often see citations and quotations from other authoritative figures then? Is that something that we can expect to find in scholastic writings?
Absolutely. So to take an example from scholastic Latin, or how it was used, auctoritas, authority, doesn't just mean authorship, or doesn't just mean power. It means literally like a text, like a line of text, a passage from something that is taken to be authoritative. So they'll refer to the text itself as an authority. And they would cite anyone they thought was authoritative in a certain field. So they'll cite Aristotle for philosophy. They'll cite Galen for medicine. They'll cite, of course, the Bible, the church fathers, the church councils. The liturgy is a source of authoritative texts. And quite often, these are just allusions. They're not always formal citations. In fact, more often than not, they're not formal citations, although sometimes they are. But there are also many maxims or just axioms that have been taken over from sources such as the Organon of Aristotle, or other logical sources like, say, Cicero or Boethius or things like that. And so there's often just allusions, because what they did was they internalized all these different authorities, and then they thought through them and they tried to apply them to the questions that they were asking.
And even though that the texts, as we have them, they are written, were scholastic texts, were they ever read aloud, or are they understood as written records or lecture notes? I mean, I think that's something that sometimes people might forget when they read, like, a quodlibral question, is that, these texts are best understood as having been written down by people after a public disputation of some sorts. They're written like lecture notes.
I agree that it's important to remember the oral context for these things. So it was a living university environment. So it's I think of a classroom, a lively classroom, and really a community of people, more so than even today, because often you'd have people from different religious orders studying together, and of course praying together in different groups and things like that, and gathering for normal discussions. And so what we have is really the product of an environment where these things are being spoken about. And even the texts we have sometimes are the lecture notes from students. Sometimes the master would have the opportunity to go back and redact or revise the notes the students took. Sometimes they might be the master's own notes that he would use in giving the lecture, and then he may or may not go back and revise them or work them up into a written text. They would have students appointed to record the lecture as accurately as possible while it was going on. And the same lectures could be given more than once. The same classes could be taught more than once, just like today in an academic environment. The professor doesn't just give a class one time, he may do it several times. So, for example, famously, we have St. Thomas's commentary on the sentences, which he would have used when teaching, because the masters were all required to lecture on the sentences. And at least for book one, or parts of book one, we have two versions of it, because we have one earlier set of classes that he gave, and we have a later set of classes that he gave. And so that really helps us to get a better view of what he was thinking. But if you just think, okay, St. Thomas wrote a commentary on the sentences, you're going to miss that point. And even the style of Latin that's used, I think, reflects the oral culture that's going on a lot of the time. So if you compare something that really is a written work, like the Summa Theologiae, with the style of something like a quodlibral question or the sentences commentary of St. Thomas, or if you go to other scholastics as well, things that are definitely recorded from an oral source, even sermons in a certain way, and things like that, you can see the contrast between the more formalized written style and the sometimes looser and even sometimes more rambling oral style.
Right. And then if I can also ask, and because of the dialectic context of the writing, do scholastics ever use like redundant words to signify breaks in sentences or paragraphs? Because I think another thing that's sort of lost on us is that punctuation, as we understand it today, wasn't something that was used in the medieval period or in the classical period. And so very often in sentences, when they're writing, they'll use a lot of quias or autems, or because, or however, tum. You often sometimes see that a lot.
Absolutely. So as texts are put into written form, it becomes very helpful to make the argument easier to follow through the use of keywords or words that indicate what something is doing in an argument. So words like ergo or igitur, which indicate the logical conclusion of something, or even words, postpositives like quidem or vero or autem, which don't really have meaning in themselves, are simply used to mark the beginning of a new thought, a new proposition, a new sentence, or something like that. Today, we express a lot of that simply by using punctuation, by formatting the text on the page so that it's not just a big block of text, but actually breaking it up by using bold and italics and things like that. And for a long time, they didn't do that. They did use many abbreviations, a huge number of scribal abbreviations. And those abbreviations indicate just how sophisticated the level of argumentation had gotten, because you'll have abbreviations for entire phrases that are used in an argument. So, for example, you might have an abbreviation that literally stands for "this is clear from Aristotle," or "this is clear from the physics," or something like that, because they were so used to writing those things over and over again. And so the scribes would have to abbreviate that. So we really are lucky in the modern world to have texts that are formatted much more clearly. And one of the things that's really needed in the field of philosophy, theology, and just scholasticism and Latin in general is more people who are willing to go back to manuscripts, because in comparison with the number of edited texts we have, the number of manuscripts is huge. We have texts out there that really are not available so much to the general public. Some of them have been digitized, but unless you can do paleography and you can read these texts, we're missing out on quite a bit. So people who are editing manuscripts are doing a tremendous service to those of us who want to know what people said about important questions.
Right, right. Okay, so I figured maybe we could shift the conversation a bit to talking more about their sort of linguistic style that's often employed by scholastics. And I wanted to maybe start off with maybe the passive tense. So how exactly do scholastics typically employ the passive tense? As I understand it, that even though in English it's kind of frowned upon to use the passive tense over the active tense, but in Latin it's very frequent and common, and so too with scholastic manuscripts.
Agreed. So somehow in English, there is a stigma to using the passive voice. It's considered bad writing or something like that. And so often you'll see that reflected in novels and stories and things like that, the heavy use of the active voice. In Latin, like in many other languages, there's no stigma attached to using the passive voice. It's just a different way of saying something. And Latin has a feature that English does not have in the same way, which is the impersonal passive. So English has a way of expressing generic conditions. For example, we might say one or you in a generic sense. So a famous example is from Virgil. Well, I'll say it in English first. This is how you get to the stars. This is how one gets to the stars. But in Latin, what Virgil actually says is "sic itur ad astra," "sic itur ad astra." So that's the passive voice, itur. And not only is it impersonal, but it's also the passive voice of a non-transitive verb, which in English is impossible. You can't do that in English. But it's a way of stating a generic condition. This is how it is gone, literally, but this is how you go to the stars. So an example that comes up probably most frequently in the scholastics is proceditur, which marks the transition from one topic of discussion to another, or marks the steps within an argument. So, for example, in the Summa, if you're reading through when you're about to switch to a new article or a new question, it'll say sic proceditur ad tertium or whatever. And that's the passive. This is how it is proceeded to the third. But it's simply saying, and now we go to the third. So we have ways of saying these things in English, but they used the impersonal passive and the passive voice at large much more frequently than we do in English.
And then another thing that's often utilized very frequently is because of auctoritas, as you said, and authority, and the sort of dialectical nature of scholastic texts. Very often the indirect discourse is employed in scholastic texts, and then that's nothing new or out of the ordinary. I mean, it's really hard to pick up, Virgil and turn to a page where there isn't, indirect discourse. But because of the style of writing, scholastics, as I understand it, they very often rely upon an indirect discourse in their writings.
Yes. So indirect discourse for our listeners is a level removed from a normal statement. So direct discourse is the dog runs. Indirect discourse is he says that the dog runs. So it's a level removed, and it's very common in many forms of writing. It's especially common in scholastic discussions because they are very philosophical in nature, and often another person's opinion is being related. So Aristotle says that something, or St. Paul says that something is the case. So that's indirect discourse. But also when talking about propositions, so to speak about a whole proposition, especially without quotation marks or italics, you use indirect discourse. Now, whereas classical Latin prefers to use the accusative with the infinitive, there are some exceptions to that. Scholastic Latin, in addition to using the accusative with the infinitive construction, will follow the example of later Latin and biblical and patristic Latin and use a variety of things, quod, quoniam, ut with the subjunctive, and so forth. There are times where this helps to combine multiple levels of abstraction where you're talking about things. So the example that comes to my mind is question 2 of the Summa, where St. Thomas wants to talk about the demonstrability of the existence of God, who's the object of the science of theology. So like a good Aristotelian, before you can engage in a science, you first define what is the object of that science, and then talk about, well, does that object exist? Is that a really existing object? And so that's why question 2 of the Summa is about the existence of God, to say this is the object of theology, and so God does exist. But at the beginning, so he's got to set up the question. Videtur quod Deum esse, sit per se notum. So this is the article addressing whether God's existence is known in itself, known through itself, or so-called self-evident. So there's 2 levels of indirect discourse, so to speak. It seems that God exists is known through itself. And so using quod and the accusative with the infinitive keeps that much clearer than using 2 accusatives and 2 infinitives in a row. So combining the flexibility that they have from late Latin is kind of helpful. So actually, to translate that, you could use even quotation marks or some other kind of paraphrase in English. It seems that the proposition God exists is known of itself, or other examples like that.
Right. Yeah. very often, I mean, that indirect discourse is used to establish propositions, and that they're as you said, that they're used sort of in place of quotation marks as we probably use them today. And another thing that's often used in scholastic texts is there's a very heavily employment of substantive clauses. So in sentences, in addition to indirect discourse. So there's plenty use of quod and ut, quoniam.
Exactly, where an entire state of affairs or a condition or a contingent matter of fact or something along those lines is spoken of as if it were a thing, because that's what you have to do in a highly philosophical discussion. You might talk about the fact that such and such and such and such, and that whole thing is being spoken of as if it were a noun by itself, as if it were a substance, for the sake of discourse. So quod, ut, quia, quoniam, with often with the subjunctive, will mark those things out.
Right. Okay, then. Well, if I can maybe shift more so to discussing some of maybe the scholastic peculiarities you find in their style of writing. When it comes to the subjunctive mood, do scholastic writers always stay consistent in their employment of the subjunctive mood in a sentence or a paragraph? In the example that you gave in your book, you showed how sometimes scholastic writers will use the subjunctive mood in the beginning, but by the time they get to the third or fourth part of the paragraph, this subjunctive is just dropped out. And is that done for rhetorical purposes? Is it stylistic purposes? What's going on?
I'll be honest, I wouldn't read too much into it. So grammarians will sometimes try to create rules or cases of usage to explain every phenomenon that occurs. So in classical Latin, sometimes grammarians will talk about, say, the future more vivid, the future less vivid, and things like that, to try to explain, well, why is it said this way in this instance and a different way in a different instance? And there may be some truth to that. There may be some value to that. However, what we find in later Latin, and certainly by the time of scholasticism, is that the subjunctive is used much more frequently, and that merely putting something into a relative clause or merely putting something into a subordinate clause of any kind is likely to force it into the subjunctive, not because it's unreal, not because it's generalized, but simply because it's in a subordinate clause. They just started doing that, but not necessarily. And they do both. So my personal opinion is there's not always a deep level of meaning to that. If you want to know why someone said sit instead of est or videat instead of videt, there may not be a deeper meaning to it. It may be they said it one way one time and a different way a different time. And I think we have examples of that when you just read through the texts, that this is just what happened. And part of it is the overuse of the subjunctive because of subordinate clauses. And sometimes they do that, and sometimes they don't.
I see. Okay. And then another thing that you've pointed out in your book that I have often, a couple times I've picked up, is with comparative adjectives, larger, smaller, greater. Sometimes scholastics will often use the comparative adjective in place of the superlatives when they really mean this is the greatest, or this is the best, or this is the most proper, or whatever. They'll often use this is the greater of the two, or this is the better of the two. Why is that? Is there a particular reason for that as well, or do we just need to just keep that in mind when we're reading?
I would just keep that in mind. That's done in the Bible and in late Latin. So for the listeners, the comparative is used when you're comparing two things, the superlative when you're comparing more than two things. And what happens in the Latin versions of the Bible and in late Latin is that sometimes the comparative is used for any number of things. So an example from St. Thomas to go back to the proofs for God's existence would be in Article 3 of Question 2 in the Summa, where he actually gives the famous 5 ways. The first one, the argument from motion, he calls the manifestior via. It's the more manifest way, but it's actually what he thinks is the most manifest way. So he's not comparing it with just one other of the 5 ways. He's comparing it with all the demonstrations that he's discussing at that point. So it's just something to keep in mind. And they inherited that from late Latin. And in particular, I would suggest from the Latin versions of the Bible.
Okay. Yeah, it is important to remember the context of sort of the use of scholastic Latin is that a lot of their patrimony is relying upon the Latin Vulgate, and this is a text in which a lot of their citations is going to be very foundational to their writings, the Latin Vulgate.
Agreed. And I'll just add a word there too about indirect discourse. That's another great example of something we were just talking about. Why the heavy use of quod, quoniam, and so forth instead of the accusative with the infinitive? Well, it's partly because of the influence of the Latin versions of Scripture, which imitated the Greek usage. So in Greek, you have hoti, you have a particle that's used for indirect discourse, just like English. That I said that something is the case, and so trying to reflect the formal structure of the Greek Bible in Latin, you have the imitation of that in Latin with quod and quoniam and so forth, quia, a lot of the time. So it's not, I mean, it's not a mistake. It's not that Saint Jerome or whoever else didn't know Latin. They certainly did. It's that they wanted to preserve the formal structure of Scripture as much as possible. And so they imitated that usage, and that just became really common. And so that's part of the development there. And I want to add another tangential comment on that too. In terms of terminology and in terms of even structure to some extent, often things are being done by the scholastics because they were done by somebody else who was considered important. So it may not be the absolute best way to say something, but it's the way that they inherited it. And we have to look at scholasticism as a method that goes together with a community that spans centuries. And the use of a common language, in this case Latin, really allowed that to happen, so that not only could someone go from one university to another, say from Oxford to Paris, and be able to communicate, they could read things that were written 500 years before them and could engage in the same conversation. And so part of that is preserving the vocabulary and the style. So you don't want the language to deviate from what you've inherited because you want to keep the conversation going. So if Cicero translated something a certain way from Aristotle, or if Boethius translated something a certain way from Aristotle, that translation, that way of saying it, has a sticking power, a staying power, and they're going to keep using that. So sometimes people wonder about the strange technical vocabulary that's used in scholastic philosophy and theology, and it can be strange. It is strange. It may not always be the best way to say something, but it's the way that it was said for centuries, and so that's why they stick with some of these things.
Another thing that is often peculiar to scholastic writing is that very often verbs are used in ways that, even though that they normally have different meanings in sort of common parlance, in the context of dialectical treatises, that they have different meanings. So you have a great list of them actually here in your book. You know, adducere, contingere, dicere, habere. A lot of these words indicating, you know, it must be said, or it must be thought, or the things of that sort.
Yeah, so in the context of academic discussion, just like in English or in any language, words have a specific meaning or can have a specific meaning. So also common Latin words can have a more specific meaning. Um, some of them are used very frequently. It, again, just like if you read a English philosophy book today, you're going to see a lot of phrases, stock phrases that are used over and over again. It is the case that such and such, for example. So in Latin, contingit ut or contingit quod. It is the case that some of these just mark out the structure of the work. So famously, respondeo dicendum quod. I answer that it should be said that, but that just marks out the response. You could just say response colon and then
Right.
put the response as it comes. Certain words, it's just important to know what they mean, and some of them were used this way in classical Latin as well. So velle, to will or to wish, in an academic context means to have an opinion, or can mean to have an opinion, and it was used that way in classical Latin too, which we say in English to some extent as well. If you're talking about the opinion of somebody else, you might say, well, he wants it to mean this, or he wants it to be the case that, and you're just saying that that's their opinion. Adducere, to cite somebody, that's a classical expression to lead them in, literally, but to cite an example, and many other cases like that. So it's just important to not be too rigid about some of the textbook definitions that we first learn when studying Latin, and instead to look at how words are being used in context. So one more example, dicere, which is to say or to state, can be used to mean indicate. So something indicates something else. You know, then it says that thing or it states that thing. But we can't translate these Latin texts with a just rigid one-to-one correspondence with English words. Sometimes we have to use a variety of words in English to express what is being expressed by otherwise normal Latin words.
Right. Right. And then going off of the tangent about the use of verbs, very often individual scholastic theologians, they often use Latin vocabulary or grammar in ways that appear anachronistic to us, but it's because they're using it in the context of philosophical discussion and philosophical patrimony, and so very often they'll use terms or phrases that if we were to translate it, it feels like a very weird phrase or saying, but we need to understand that they're speaking in an academic context of philosophical and theological discussion. So you show how in the example you give in your book how with respect to demonstration, sometimes the scholastics will say non habet locum. You could translate that locum as location, but if you understand it in the context of syllogistic, demonstration, what it really more accurately translates to is, this has no basis.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's a great example. It's a technical term, locus. It's the direct translation of the Greek topos, which means place, kind of generically, but has a variety of meanings in later medieval and early modern discussions about philosophy and theology and other academic subjects. You'll see what are called commonplaces, loci communes. Some works are even titled that, loci communes. That is sources of argumentation or kind of standard places to go to for an argument or standard places of appeal. Cicero describes a locus as a sedes argumenti, the seat of argument, the basis for argument. So, as you're reading along, if you see the word locus, sometimes it means place, no problem. But sometimes it's got a very specific meaning. If someone is rejecting an argument because it doesn't have a locus, they might be saying this doesn't have any grounding or any basis. That is, there's no recognized source for the argument that's being made. And instead, it might be an argument that is voluntarius, that is arbitrary, or just wishful thinking. In other words, you can say this, but there's no basis for it.
I see. And very often than not, sometimes in order to sort of best translate certain words or phrases that are employed by scholastic theologians, is that it helps to sort of understand sort of their more broader philosophical commitments. So we just had Dr. Gavin Kerr on the podcast to discuss Aquinas' third way, and he points out that words like that he uses in the third way, aliquando or quandoque, it's translated typically, at some given time in the past, but I think that given Aquinas' more broad philosophical commitments, it makes more sense, even though that it's not, it's a little hard on the Latin. It makes more sense to read it those terms under a present tense reading. So sometimes in order to understand and translate the works, you have to understand their broader philosophical commitments.
Absolutely agree. And some of that is just the limitations of language in general. So we human beings are trying to express in words concepts that we have, and those concepts are themselves more or less adequate to realities and are being combined into propositions and things like that, about which we are forming judgments and trying to reason. And so we're doing our best, but language is limited. And you have to use words that have multiple meanings. They have to have multiple possible significations or nuances to them in order to communicate. So yeah, an aliquando, well, it happens at some point, or it ever happens. Or this leads you to ask the question, is the point about time, or is the point about possibility? And it's ambiguous. The word itself is ambiguous. Sometimes you'll be reading a text and you'll come across a phrase or a word where you know what it means in one sense, but it seems very strange in the context that it's in. And in those cases, I always say pause and do some research, because it might be a technical term. And that's one of the dangers we can get into even if we know Latin, but we don't know the technical terms that are being used, because you might be able to translate every word in an expression, but not really know what it's talking about, which is not the fault of the language. It's simply that it's a technical discussion. And just like if I were to pick up, the manual for how to do advanced surgery or how to engineer a rocket ship or something in English, there would be a lot of English words that I know, but I wouldn't know what they're talking about because I wouldn't know the subject matter as well. That happens in philosophy and theology as well. So it can be helpful to have a really good lexicon, or even just to do some Google searches or whatever it takes to see, is this a technical term or not, and what does it mean? So that's always my recommendation, is if you don't understand an expression and it seems strange and it seems like it's expressing something particular, you're not sure about it, just stop and try to look it up. But one of the things that can also happen as we're reading along and so forth is that we just miss something, and we're going to make mistakes in our interpretation and our understanding. Sometimes that's because of a lack of knowledge of the subject matter. Sometimes it's because the author might not have been that clear. We don't want to treat these texts like they're divinely inspired either. They may not have said it in the best way, or they may have said it in a great way and the manuscript was corrupted at some point. We have better and worse copies of different works by different people. So there could be an issue with the text, and that might be why it doesn't make as much sense to us. And one final thing I'll just say about that too is the advantage of Latin is its longevity. It's not that Latin is a magical language. And sometimes Catholics, especially maybe Catholics who are more interested in Latin, will treat it like it's this quasi magical language. It is sacred, but it's sacred not because it's sacred in itself. It's a normal human language. It's sacred because of how it's been used. So it's sacred because of its use in the liturgy, and it's become important, especially important for Catholics of the Latin Church and for those studying the history of Western thought because it's been used. Greek might have been a better choice. Some other language might have been a better choice, but that's not what happened. It's simply the fact that Latin is the language that was used for centuries to have these discussions. That's what makes it valuable. And that's why Latin is worth learning. It's because it gives us access to the scholastic conversation that has been going on for centuries. So sometimes people are overly reverential with the Latin language or with the authors that they're reading. It's a normal language. It has all the complexities and limitations that you would expect a language to have, but it is valuable because of what has been said and what has been thought through in that language.
So then, if I can maybe ask a couple closing questions, this has been an amazing conversation. And do you have any general advice you would recommend for those who'd want to take a dive into scholastic texts? Did you have any maybe book recommendations for those who'd like to learn more? Or
Well, I did write a little book called The Shortcut to Scholastic Latin, and just full disclosure, it is very short, and that was the point of it because there are longer books out there, and I myself am little by little working on a much longer book to help people with scholastic Latin, which I hope at some point will see the light of day. But one of the things I realized in my own work of researching and translating was that what would have helped me when I was first getting started the most was to just have a list of some expressions or some turns of phrase that are used over and over and over again, and to just have some general background knowledge. And I had to work a lot of that out myself and research in these other things and do the work to try to learn. There's no substitute for practice. So anyone who wants to really be able to do Latin and do scholastic Latin in particular has got to study the subject matter, study what the scholastics studied. That is a piece of advice that I think is too often forgotten, but is one of the most important. You've got to read what they read, and ideally to read it in the Latin version that they read it in. So then you'll realize, wow, this expression that's being used by St. Thomas or St. Bonaventure or whoever comes directly from Boethius. And that's why it's said this way, or this expression comes from James of Venice, and he's translating Aristotle into Latin, and he said it this way, and that's why it's said this way. And you realize, okay, this actually goes back to Aristotle, but you wouldn't recognize it in Aristotle because the Latin version changed it in some way to make it not as immediately recognizable. And to, read Avicenna, to read Averroes, to read the people that they read, and then you'll see what they're really doing. So that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of practice. You just got to put in the hours and hours and hours that it takes to read through these texts, to study the subject matter, and so forth. There are some books I would recommend. So my little book is just to get people kind of started, hopefully, but I would like to finish the longer book at some point, and I hope that will be some kind of contribution. One of the better books is very hard to come by, unfortunately. And it's a book by Emilio Springhetti, papal Latinist for a long time. And he wrote a book called Latinitas Foncium Philosophiae Scholasticae, the Latinity or the Latin of the sources of scholastic philosophy. and it was published in Rome by the Pontifical Salesian University. And I want to say in the 1960s, but it's never been reprinted, so it's very hard to find, and it is written in Latin, so it's a Latin book in Latin about the Latin of the scholastics. There are a couple of good lexicons out there. For St. Thomas, there's De Ferrari's lexicon. He's got two versions of it. There's a very big one. There's a somewhat abridged one. And then there are general scholastic lexicons out there as well, which define technical terms and things like that. So those are some things that I would recommend. But the key thing is really just to study the subject matter, to read what the scholastics read, and then to spend a lot of time with it.
Well, Father Schrader, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.